Okay, perfect. So I am currently in one of these buildings. I'm currently down in the southeast of China, in the Tulos. So the Tulos are these kind of self-contained villages within this kind of donut-shaped structure. So there's about 800 people in each of the Tulos. So I'm just going to get some water. Thank you, thank you. So yeah, if I show you my current location. In fact, I am in this one. I'm just inside one of these windows. And so what we're doing down here in Beijing, we are starting an education project. What happens a lot in China, in a lot of villages and rural areas, is that the adults go away to work. And so that's very true in this area. So a lot of the men particularly have moved away to factories to find work. And so almost this entire town is young children and women. And so what we're doing down here is we're starting an education project. So we're going to do work with the kids. Once a year, we're going to bring down a team of educators. I'm down here with 10 of my team. And then we're also going to start install high-speed internet and some computers so we can do online tutoring and teaching with the students down here, with the kids down here, because right now they have no formal education. They wake up most days. There is something called a school in the village, but it's mostly kind of self-directed. And a lot of these kids are 11, 12 years old. So that really means playing most of the day. But then we're also working with the women in this village. They're incredibly entrepreneurial. They really want to do stuff. We discovered last night, we only arrived last night, but we discovered that they make Rubik's Cubes in this village. One of the women in this village once worked in a factory making Rubik's Cubes. And she said to the villagers, we should do the same thing. So they set up a small factory and they now produce plastic Rubik's Cubes in a very, very small volume. So that is where I am right now. So a little bit about me. I moved to China 13 years ago after studying history of art and archaeology at university. I came out here in 2001 first, and I sort of felt like there was a lot of opportunity. For the first 8 years that I was here, I was a teacher in an international school. I also did some examining for the British Council. And then 5 years ago, myself and co-founder founded Atlas Education. I guess it's very important to say as well, because I'm here, but I am the co-founder of the business, and my business partner is very much one of the reasons why the business thrives. She's an incredible person. I've learned huge amounts from her, and she really holds up more than half of the business in many ways. So what we do, very briefly, we have a project in 25 public schools called Flourish, where we teach entrepreneurship to government school students, middle school and high school students. We run summer courses in the UK for Chinese students. We have a learning center in Beijing where we teach about 200 families. And we recently have started running hackathons, again, in public schools. This one on the bottom right was one that we did before Theresa May, the British Prime Minister's visit to Wuhan in June. So that is Atlas Education. This year, in January, we founded Venture Education. So Venture Education kind of has three main pillars. One of them is enterprise and entrepreneurship education. One of them is UK-China partnerships, and one of them is girls and women's education. So almost everything that we do kind of falls under one of those criteria. And what we're doing down here, I guess, would go under the first and third. Okay, so that is a very, very brief introduction to me. But I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that I have maybe learn about doing business in China, or more broadly about doing business in a developing country. So I'm going to kind of go through a list of certain things. The titles maybe are a little bit boring, but I hope that maybe the content is more interesting and relevant to you guys. About 3 years ago, we opened a school. We took over a house in a residential compound in Beijing. We converted it into a school. We had classrooms, we had a theater, we had spaces indoors and outdoors for teaching kids. It was amazing. It was beautiful. We opened that, and then within 6 months, we got complaints from the neighbors, and we had daily arrivals from the police, and they shut down our school. And we had invested virtually all of our money in the school. I've just seen the arrival of a child who's appearing. Hi. Okay, so we had the school shut down, and this kind of made me reflect on sort of a truism about doing business in a developing country, and that is that the opportunities are high, but the market certainty is low. And I think that that's a really kind of important thing to acknowledge and a kind of thing to reflect on, because I love opportunity. I love trying new ideas. I'm very happy to try things and fail things, but you can't take anything for granted, and the law can change, regulations can change, the business environment can change, your customer base can change overnight. So, you know, we very frequently have to do kind of very rapid pivots or kind of very rapid shifts in what we're doing just because of changes in the business environment. And, you know, one of the things I say to people is that doing business in China, you know, at that point when our school got shut down, I honestly had sleepless nights, you know, and when people say that about business, I mean, that was really, I was not sleeping at night. I was going the whole night fretting and turning about what was going to happen. But now I've changed. I've changed as an entrepreneur. I've changed as a business person, and I'm very happy now to go to sleep and have a million things undone, have contracts be broken, have businesses being shut down, and I sleep like a baby. So there is opportunity everywhere, but you have to be willing to face the chaos. That's my first reflection on business in China. I don't know. I suspect maybe you've heard about kind of face in Asian business cultures. It is a thing, but I think it kind of very often gets misunderstood as kind of ego or arrogance or something along those lines. So I just wanted to kind of give two very brief stories about face. I have been in China for 13 years. I have never been involved in, sorry, let me just see if I can move that. Sorry. I have been in China for 13 years, and I have never been involved in a fight. Now, I'm not an aggressive person, so I'm not usually involved in fights anyway, but I grew up in the UK, and definitely on a Friday night or a Saturday night, if you go drinking, it's very possible that you might get involved in an altercation unwillingly. I've never been involved in a fight in China, and so what's interesting about that is that China is a face culture. So Chinese people are not aggressive generally. Chinese men not aggressive. There's not as many street fights or that kind of thing. Avoiding violence in China is easy. If you're in a bar and some guy insults you, you say sorry and then it's over. It's finished. But if you said to that guy, if that guy said to you, fuck you, and you turn around and said to them, fuck you, they will stab you to death. That is what face culture is. And they will do that not because they're an aggressive person, but because to back down would be to lose face. And they will do anything at any cost to not lose face. And that's true in bars, but that's also true in business. And so kind of acknowledging that and understanding how that works, both in China and Korea and Japan, is really, really important. And what it really means is never getting angry and never kind of insulting the other person. So I just wanted to share one more story that is one of my personal kind of changing moments in China. So about 10 years ago, I was going to move out of my apartment, and I had a very, very old landlady. And I said to her, okay, I'm going to move out.
Exactly. It is what people is producing.
Sorry?
Just someone had their mic open for a second.
Okay. So I was about to move out of my apartment, and I said to my landlady, I said, look, I'm going to move out. I'm going to give you a month's notice, just like the contract says. So could you give me my deposit back? And she said no. And she didn't give any reasons, which is quite common in China. She just said, I'm not going to give you your deposit back, you know, because in China, once you've given someone money, they're not going to give it back to you. That doesn't make any sense. So I sort of thought about it, and I looked around the apartment, and there was a really nice hand-carved wooden cupboard. So I thought when I moved out, I would just take that cupboard, because I sort of figured that was approximately the value of my deposit. And I felt like that was a kind of fair exchange, that she would keep my money and I would keep her cupboard. So I moved out, I took the cupboard, and she called me a week later and she said, think there's been a mistake. I think you might have taken my cupboard by accident. And I said, oh my God, yeah, there was a mistake. The delivery guys must have picked up my cupboard, your cupboard. I'm really sorry. It was a complete mistake. And she said, oh, well, can you bring my cupboard back to the apartment? And I said, yeah, no problem. I'll bring it back and you can give me my deposit. And she said, yeah, of course, of course. Why don't you bring it to my apartment? I said, no. How about I bring it outside the apartment building? Because obviously once I put it in the apartment, she wasn't going to give my deposit back. So I bring it back to the building. I exchange the cupboard. She gives me her deposit. I bought her a bottle of white wine. I said, thank you. You've been the most amazing landlord. She said to me, you've been a completely amazing tenant. And then we parted ways, smiling and waving at each other. But obviously deep down underneath, we both thought the other person was a crook. So that was a moment where I felt like I had really understood how things operate in China, how to maintain face, how to maintain face of the others. So that was a kind of turning point in understanding how you work in China and how you operate. Because if you ever get annoyed or you ever get angry, then you've lost. So the third thing, oh, sorry, this is a spelling mistake. So the third thing is a concept called Guangxi, which you may have heard of. And this is essentially connections. Now, connections exist obviously in every country. But what Guangxi really means is a kind of deep relationship with somebody where you will trust them over anything else. And to really understand this, it's important to understand that, in 1990, China was a fully socialist country. It still is to some degree, but it was an authoritarian state, one-party state, and it was fully socialist. And, it's changed dramatically over 30 years, but trust is very low in China. Trust is very low, basically outside of your family group. And so building Guangxi with people, building connections with people is not just about having big connections. Connections maybe, in kind of people in senior positions or people in, wealthy people, these kind of things, about the depth of the connection. And I think this is really misunderstood by foreigners when they come to China or they go to anywhere in East Asia, that relationships are not something that you can rush. So even if you meet powerful people, it's when they introduce you to their family, it's when they trust you to do a favor for them, that's when you're really developing a connection. And, some of the connections that I have now, they've taken 4, 5, 6 years to develop. And even now, we're slowly still getting to a point where we trust one another. But the thing about Guangxi is once you have that trust is like blood. And they will do anything to protect you. And they will ask you for favors and you will ask them for favors. And it is incredibly powerful, but it takes time and it is about depth, not about kind of initial contact. So there's a very famous book written by an American guy called James McGregor called 1 Billion Customers. And he actually based this book on a book written by somebody called Carl Crow, another American. I think it was in the 1930s or the 1940s, called 300 Million Customers, which shows you how quickly the population in China has grown. Sorry, just very... It is very cold here, I should let you know. This book really just has one central message, which is that there is the myth in China of 1 billion customers. There is the myth that because there is volume, that means that it's kind of easy to make money. And, that is not true at all. It is very, very hostile here as a business environment. And it's very, very difficult to break into China and to make money in China. And one of the things that I say all the time to people is that there's two things that Chinese people trust. The first is personal connections. As I explained, Guangxi, these are immediate connections, friends, people you've been working with for a decade or family, or big organizations. And the reason that they trust big organizations is something that I guess a concept I like is herd immunity. The kind of the protection you have in the herd. And if you are sending your kid, for example, in my industry, if you're sending your kid to a chain of schools and they have 20,000 schools across China, you kind of have protection that even if those schools do a bad job, you can say, well, millions of other families send their kids there. So that's it. There's two things, big companies and personal connections. So if you come here as a small to medium-sized business and you hope to thrive, you're going to find it incredibly difficult. Because if you don't have an international brand like Apple or Nike, or if you don't have an incredibly close relationship with a Chinese person or with numerous Chinese people, then you are going to find it very, very difficult to even enter the market in any way, shape or form. So, one thing I should say about my learning center is we work with about 200 families. They're very, very wealthy families. We don't have a website. We don't do any marketing at all. We have grown continually over the course of 4 years, and we purely operate like mouth to mouth. So we have a foothold, but our foothold is not based on marketing. It's not based on our product, on anything other than trust in our product. And I guess that very much relates to I was at a talk the other day from an entrepreneur in Beijing. He's been here longer than me. He's a German guy and he's been here 20 years. So I should make it very clear, by the way, I don't have any kind of business background in terms of academics. I've not done a business degree. I've not done an MBA. And he sort of introduced this idea of strategic alignment. And very much what he was just saying is, you sort of have to work out as a foreigner in a market, whether it's China or East Africa or Southeast Asia, what exactly is your advantage? And what exactly do you bring that people find difficult or can't do themselves? And I think that's really important in China. And one of the things that I would say is, if you're hoping to enter China in any way, shape, or form, it's really about saying to yourself, what is it that I can offer that a Chinese person can't do? Because China is growing and moving so quickly that they have tens and hundreds of thousands of students studying abroad every year, working in foreign companies, coming back, sharing information. So it's really trying to find out, like, what is it that you can offer that maybe isn't being offered here. And I think also being very realistic about this, because I think sometimes there's a little bit of arrogance from foreign organizations coming into markets that they sort of feel that they know best. But in reality, there's very smart, very, very kind of connected, very wealthy people in every country who have the capacity to do what you do. So that's pretty important. This actually doesn't really have anything to do with China per se, but it is something that really appeals to me. And I just wanted to share a couple of stories with you about why I think kind of hunting the niche is the key, not only to kind of running a successful business, but also to kind of maybe having a slightly easier life further down the line. I host a pub quiz in the British Embassy once a month. And I've been doing that for about 7 years. They have a supplier of alcohol in the British Embassy, and he's a Dutch guy. And he used to work for the Dutch Embassy in Indonesia. And he realized that they needed to buy alcohol from abroad. And Indonesia obviously is mostly a dry country because it's majority Islamic. So he started importing alcohol from Holland. And he also realized that through diplomatic bags and through diplomatic mail, he could get away with not paying tax on the alcohol, so he could get it at a really, really good price. So he started off importing it into European embassies in Indonesia. Then he started expanding to other Asian countries, to embassies only, including China. So now this guy has a business where he imports alcohol to European embassies throughout the whole of Asia. And I just think this is a brilliant business, because no one is going to take this from him. It is virtually impossible for anybody to take this, because first of all, he has the experience of working in embassies. He's built it by going embassy to embassy. So, I think that's something on a personal level that I'm always looking for out in China, is kind of finding opportunities that are unique to me. And increasingly what I'm realizing with that is that that's my connections to the UK. I'm the chair of the British Chamber of Commerce Education Forum in China. That's very useful. I have a lot of connections with government in the UK, and that's something that I can offer. That's a niche that I have that's fairly unique, because I'm one of the few British people out here focusing not only on kind of product and services side of education, but also on kind of government and policy stuff that's not in government themselves. So sort of finding that niche, whether or not it's a product or a service or wherever you can find it. There's sort of hordes of children walking around outside. It's a little bit distracting. Okay, so this is just a personal thing. And what I say here is kind of based on experience. So I'm certainly not ignorant about the kind of the opportunities in China and the successes of what China has to offer. One of the things that China lacks right now is kind of quality in kind of manpower and human resources. You know, in my industry, for example, you know, we see a lot of people opening schools, a lot of business people moving into education because they know that there's money in education. So just to give you an example, 93% of 93% of children in China do after school something. That's 93% in the entire country have paid money to do something after school. That number in the UK is about 23%. You know, mostly in the UK, people who do after school activities are middle class kids. In China, it's almost everybody. So there's huge amounts of money in education. You've got a lot of people entering the market who are business people. They've got money, they've got land, they've got access to the right licenses. And, you know, they can bypass the legal structures. They've got connections. But the thing that they focus on last when they build a school is hiring a team. And even when they come to hire a team, the problem is, you know, 30 years ago, there was no modern education in China. And so even hiring qualified people, teachers, director of studies, heads of schools, that's really, really difficult in China. And so, you know, thinking about what the advantages are of foreign businesses in China, like increasingly, I think it's based on service, it's based on human resources. You know, there are certain things that still China finds very difficult to do. You know, things like events organization. You know, some of the best events planners that I know in China, and I'm talking about big events, you know, organizing things like the Olympics, this kind of stuff, they're still foreign because, you know, running something that complicated that requires a real network of kind of educated, smart, experienced individuals, China just doesn't have that history yet. It just doesn't have enough people who are qualified to kind of manage complex human structures. So that's something where I think still Americans, British people have a real advantage out here. Value is kind of an interesting one everywhere. I'm not going to say anything particularly kind of unique here, but, you know, I wanted just to share some things about my own business. You know, so outside of the Beijing airport, there is a highway. And when you drive along that highway, there are hundreds of cars parked on the highway. And the reason those cars are parked on the highway, and I'm talking like Mercedes-Benz, Range Rovers, Porsches, the reason they're parked on the highway is because they don't want to pay for parking in the airport. So these are people who have money, but they don't think that it's valuable to pay money in the car park. They think that's a ripoff. And so this is a kind of good example of where people in China, I think this is true anywhere, but particularly in China, like they will pay for what they perceive to be valuable. And value is the thing. They are not price sensitive at all. So in my center, we charge, it's one-to-one. And as I said, we work with wealthy families. It's one-to-one. We charge $120 an hour. And in January this year, we raised our prices from $120 an hour to $150 an hour. So we are completely full. We have a waiting list for students. We operate 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, 50 weeks a year. We are completely full. We are doubling the size of our center and moving in next month. We raised our prices from $120 an hour to $150 an hour. We didn't tell anyone we were doing this, and no one said a word. So that is a business where we have trust with our families, and they do not care about money, because the truth is, what they understand is they could go and try and find other educators in China, but they are not going to find people who care as much about their kids as we do. And so, you know, I think that people hear a lot of those kind of stories in China. And certainly, I think if I had started, or I'd said to you, look, we charge $150 an hour for tutoring, you know, you'd probably think, you know, geez, I could just jump on a plane right now and start a tutoring company in China. But obviously, all of these things have come together, and there's now enough trust with our families, and our kind of Guangxi is good enough with them that they understand that this isn't about money anymore. You know, and just one more story. We worked with a really, really wealthy family in China. They imported, they're the importers for Bentley. They represent plane companies, Burberry. I mean, they are a huge billion dollar enterprise in China. And we taught their daughter, and she told us a story one day that I just thought was amazing. So they have this really, really big house outside of Beijing that had a swimming pool. And they wanted to get rid of the swimming pool because they never used it. And they wanted to install underfloor heating in their house. You know, this is a vast house, you know, with massive garages and huge grounds. So they got some construction guys in to fit the underfloor heating and to fill in the swimming pool. And after a month or so, they looked out on their garden and there was just a brown rectangle. And they realized that what the guys had done is, rather than getting rid of the swimming pool, they had just filled the swimming pool in with concrete and then put turf on top of the swimming pool, or the big block of concrete. So obviously all of that grass had died and they had just been left with a kind of brown rectangle of grass. And then all of the kind of underfloor heating in their house burst and broke. So this was a point where, you know, arguably one of the wealthiest families in China wanted to fix their house and simply couldn't find quality. And so in the end, they went to Taiwan. They represent, you know, the restaurant chain in the US, Nobu. They represent Nobu in Asia. So they went to Taiwan. They got the building firm who constructed Nobu in Taiwan, which they represented. They flew over construction workers to China to work on their house outside of Beijing because they could not find quality construction workers in China. So you know, that's the kind of thing where, you know, in my head at that point, I realized, you know, some of the best construction workers in the UK are Polish. They're from Poland. And, you know, I sort of thought at that point, geez, you know, I could hire, you know, a team of 8 Polish construction workers. I could fly them to China and I could charge 20 times the price for construction. And I could say, you know what, I'm going to charge you 20 times the price for construction, but I promise you what we do will last for the next 100 years. And you know what, like there would be a queue out the door of people willing to pay that money. So there is a hunt for value in China. People don't care about price because price doesn't mean anything. At the highest end, I would say. So I know that kind of people always talk about failure when they talk about entrepreneurship, and they talk about how important it is, and obviously that's very, very true. But I guess one thing I wanted to say was that I don't know how many of you have lived abroad or worked abroad or ever tried to start something abroad. It's actually kind of a nice way to start an enterprise because in some sense, you know, ultimate failure, you know, you always have the opportunity to move home. You know, like I guess if I'd started a business in London where all of my friends are, all of my family are, and then I'd failed, I guess the kind of dent to my ego, or the kind of, you know, the level of kind of connections that I might have broken, that it would have been stronger and it would have been tougher, you know. But out here, there's a kind of feeling that, you know, I'm more willing to risk things. I'm more willing to try things because ultimately I know that, you know, no matter what happens. Sorry, I've got a little visitor. Hi.
Hi.
So you know, out here there's kind of that nice feeling that you know, you can kind of fail, and you know, if I'm honest, deep down underneath it all, I know that I could move home. And so there's something kind of nice about that and kind of reassuring about that. And you know, I don't know. And like I say, if any of you are kind of pondering moving abroad and starting something, it's kind of a nice environment to do so. And obviously, you know, all the other things I'm saying too. So this is something about doing business in a developing country, and China especially. How many of you have kind of heard of this kind of concept of effectuation?
You can raise a hand or click yes if you know it, if you're familiar with effectuation. And Julian, I'll give you a number. So either just raise a hand or click the yes button on the bottom left in the participants box. We have, so far it's all no's, including myself, so.
Excellent. Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. So there is an academic, an American Indian academic who operates out of the University of Virginia, and her name is Sarasvati. And I will send you a link, Michael, and you can send it to everybody. It's one of my favorite articles, and it's called "What Makes Entrepreneurs Entrepreneurial." It's about 14 pages long, and it's honestly one of the best things I've ever read. I read this one day, and I sent it to my business partner at about midnight, and I said, "You have to read this." She read it. An hour later, she sent me back a message. She was like, this is us, and this is incredible. Because honestly, up until that point, we had thought that we were total idiots who were just kind of bumbling our way through business in China. Effectuation really says this. It's that there's two ways of thinking. One is effectual thinking, and one is causal thinking. So causal thinking is this. I have a goal, and I want to reach that goal. So I'm going to produce a business plan. I'm going to go out and find out what neat resources I need to achieve that goal, and then I'm going to move towards that goal. And if anything happens along the way that kind of stops me on my path towards that goal, I'm going to overcome it, and I'm going to meet my goal. That is kind of causal thinking. And effectual thinking is that you start with a bunch of resources, and primarily those resources are who you are, what you know, and who you know. And then you kind of just head off without any kind of goals in mind, and then you just kind of see where it takes you. So I guess the difference would be like, cooking towards a recipe would be causal thinking. Effectual thinking would be going to your fridge, seeing what's inside, and then deciding just to try and cook something completely new. And the reason I sort of say this is, first of all, I think of myself as an effectual thinker, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs are, but also China is a country of effectual thinkers. And so it's really important to understand that coming here, that like nobody gives a shit about your business plan. To them, that's just a kind of spring point, a kind of well to think about new ideas. So they will look at your business plan and say, oh, that's kind of interesting. Let's start doing that. And then they will move into something completely different within a month. And so kind of understanding that here people don't have solid plans. They don't know, often it's kind of blind leading the blind as well. They don't know whether they can do something until they've tried. So doing business in China, and I think this is true in a lot of Southeast Asia as well, really comes down to kind of, I'll have a conversation with someone, Chinese. I'll say, I was sort of thinking about this, and they'll say, okay, I was thinking about this. I'll invest some time and resources into doing something. Then I'll sort of pass that over to them. They'll invest a little bit of time and energy. And I guess the way that I think about it is like, it's kind of this cloud. Everything is incredibly foggy. You don't really know what's happening. And then very slowly, kind of something a bit more solid, a little bit more tangible begins to develop. You sort of test that, you sort of iterate that a little bit. And then over time, that's how businesses are built in China. And that's how billion-dollar businesses are built in China. Nobody ever sets out with a plan, because as I said earlier, with opportunity and with kind of market certainty being so low, it's really important not to get wedded to ideas out here. And one of the things that you may have heard kind of quite famously about China is that contracts don't mean anything here. Contracts just represent a moment in time. So the idea that you sign a contract and then everything is kind of neat and tidy and then that's what you're going to do is absolutely 100% untrue. You sign a contract and that basically says, on this date at this time, this is what we thought, and it's a nice idea and we should probably try and stick to this. And then a month later, they will change everything and you will decide, okay, and then you will decide to change everything also. So that is how business is done. And if you are uncomfortable with that, and if you are uncomfortable with uncertainty and chaos, it is going to be incredibly challenging to operate out here, ultimately. So final couple of things. I know these concepts are not new to entrepreneurship or to business, and they're definitely not new to China, but things are changing so dramatically in China. And I don't think any country on earth has undergone the changes that China has undergone in the last 30 years. You've taken 900 million people out of poverty. That is beyond amazing. Whatever criticisms you might have about the Chinese government, they have taken 900 million people who are living, on the brink, to having food, to having a job, to having a television. They have done an incredible job, and the changes are enormous. And so Chinese people are very, very used to change. And I just wanted to kind of say a story about, I was back in the US, not back in the US, I was in the US this summer at Babson College in Boston, where you guys are. And I was doing a kind of teacher training course for entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship educators. And it was really interesting. In one day, I had 3 people say the same thing to me. I was in a taxi, I was getting food at lunch, I was in a classroom with another American, and all three said to me, I said, oh, they said, what do you do? And I said, I live in China. And they said, oh, China, Chinese people copy everything. And I just thought it was really interesting. I thought that was really interesting that was the kind of first thing that was thought about China. And it kind of made me reflect a little bit that that might be true. I don't think that China is the first country that has copied people and become successful. America might also have been one of them. But it was really interesting to me, I guess, in some way, that might be true. And if that's true, how do we live in a world where every product is copyable? That is the future. And I think that, China is moving so dramatically in terms of everything, in terms of how they approach IP, in terms of how they approach money, in terms of how they approach the law. And so we can either decide that eventually China will become a kind of liberal democracy and will start following the rule of law, or we can think that maybe this is the Chinese millennium and the way that they do things is going to change everything. Now, I don't have a particular, I'm not saying it's going to be one way or the other, but I think being open to the fact that the world is kind of changing and that China is changing the world and that the way that they approach things may have an impact on how business is done globally is really important. Because if you're going to enter into a third market, if you're going to go into Kenya and you're going to operate against Chinese businesses, they are going to compete very, very differently to how you compete. And you can either kind of claim, well, they don't know what they're doing, or, they don't get it. But the reality is, they're growing very, very rapidly, and they are making the rest of the world do things the way that they do things. And I think that's really important to understand, not just within China, but also in the rest of the developing world and increasingly the developed world. So this kind of final point that I wanted to go with, there's a really, really great quote that I love by Nelson Mandela, which is that I never lose. I either win or I learn. And I love that. I think it's brilliant. And I would say that one of the things that maybe kind of brings together everything about all of the kind of random stories that I've talked about today is that one of the advantages that I think we have, my organization in China, so we grew, by the way, we started 3 years ago with 2 people. We now have 82 people within 3 years. And one of the reasons I think that we've grown so quickly is that we always give first. And, on a kind of more broader level, I think this is just a good strategy in terms of being an entrepreneur and kind of operating in life, being an employee also, I really resent it when I kind of have, really young graduate staff who kind of, they kind of want you to grow them. And then they kind of, they want you to give first, and then they kind of say that they're willing to give or they're willing to work hard, and I think I've always been somebody who kind of has just done my best at what I do. I've always been willing to give first. And I'm just sorry, I'm babbling very, very quickly, but one thing, we always ask people in job interviews now is, what is the worst job that you've ever had? And we ask them about what is the worst job that they've ever had. And we hope that they say something like, picking fruit or working in a factory or, working in a really terrible bar. But that's not really the core of what we're trying to get to. The subsequent questions that we then follow up with is how did you do in that job? So if they tell me like, oh yeah, I worked in this really terrible bar, it was really horrible. I had to work really late at night. So I worked there for a month and then I quit. That's not really the kind of tale that we're looking for. What we want to hear. And I have one member of staff in my team who worked in a really, really rough bar in Scotland. And I said, so what did you do? And she said, oh, actually, like I was the most successful person there. They used to have kind of mystery shoppers come in and review the bar staff. And I was always the highest ranked bartender. And I always did a great job and I got promoted. This was a part-time job when she was at university, but that's someone who to me is willing to give and willing to try their best, even not knowing that they're going to get anything back. And I think that's obviously very important to any job that you do. I think it's very important also to entrepreneurship. And so, just to kind of bring this back around to where we started, that's what we're doing right now here in the Tulos in Fujian. So we got in contact with this Chinese NGO group who are trying to kind of bring life back to the Tulos, because obviously, like I said, a lot of the adults, they move away and they leave behind the youngest children and they leave behind the eldest. And in this case, the eldest women and the youngest children are kind of just left to fend by themselves. But we came down here without asking for anything. We've come down here with a team of 11 educators from the UK and the US. We're bringing energy. We're going to do, the whole of today is going to be classes. We're going to do some drama with the kids. We're going to do all this stuff. We're going to donate computers. So this room I'm in is currently the only room in the whole village that has internet. We're going to make sure that we spread internet throughout the village. We are going to do all of this without asking for anything in response. And I don't mean that we would ask for anything from these people themselves, but we're not going to say, can you do this? Can you do that? We're just going to continue to ask them, what do you need? And over time, that's how we're going to build Guangxi. That's how, we're going to kind of build a really, really successful, sustainable kind of social impact project that's going to really make a difference. But if we come down here saying, look, we're this organization, we want to do this, 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 so we need you to do this, this. That's not how it works. It's not how I think it works in China. I don't think it's more broadly how it works anywhere. So yeah, I guess the final thing I would say is that kind of the way to build business in China is to give first and then to see the response of the person that you're working with. And if you give and they take and then they try and take again, then they might not be the right partner. But if you give and they take and then they give to you, then that's how you're going to build relationships and that's how you're going to build something sustainable. So I think this is an incredible place to do business, but it's definitely not the kind of legal safe structure that you might have in the US or the UK. And so you definitely have to be willing to kind of adapt and give a little. Right. That is, that's the end of everything. But yes, feel free to ask anything.
Julian, thank you so much. The good thing is that I met Julian, I think in the first 2 weeks that I was living in Beijing, and you just sort of made sense of my very hard to make sense 4 months that I lived in Beijing, where I was like, why are they doing business that way? Like they're never going to survive. And you totally made sense of it. So now there's a method to the madness, and I appreciate you making it seem so simple and organized. So we actually do have a few people that have questions for you. So I'll just call on people as they've, in the order that they raised their hands. So Margot, you're first. Margot, go ahead.
Julian, I just have some comments. So first of all, thank you so much for taking the time.
No problem. It's awesome.
I cannot think of a better hour that I could have allocated in this week, this month, or this year. This has been amazing. Every single concept that you're talking about, it's so applicable to life, not just to doing business in China, but when you're talking about faith and relationships, and everyone in US is so crazy about networking, and maybe if they stopped and try to just build genuine relationships, maybe that would help, right? And you said something important about and the story about how you can't get angry, but if you think about it, that in just real world in general, everywhere else, if you get angry, then you're just making a fool of yourself. So it's a great lesson to us, to at least to me, just to keep in mind to just keep the composure. Thank you so much. I mean, I am so touched.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for what you're doing too. I mean, what you're doing is amazing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. Thank you. I mean, one thing also just to say, just to one follow-up with that is that we, my venture education, the new organization that we founded this year, there's 5 senior partners. And I think one thing that's really important for us, actually very much related to that not getting angry thing, is that we go out probably once every week or once every 2 weeks, and we get some beers and we vent about everything. So I think that's also really important. It's like when you're working, we have a project with the Ministry of Education, and it's a nightmare. I mean, it is working with government officials. One of the things that they do, the way that they critique projects, which is very kind of 1970s China, is they sit you in a room and then they have a list of problems, and then they read out the problems one by one and they explain them in detail. So these meetings often will last about 3 to 4 hours, where you just have to sit there and listen to criticism. And I mean, the first time I did that, I honestly was like, what the hell is this? This is madness, and I left being like, right, like I'm never doing this again. But now I sit there, kind of listen to them. I have my phone on my lap and I'm kind of checking WeChat and reading the newspaper. I'm nodding, I'm saying thank you, that's so wise, that's fantastic, thank you. And then I leave, I go for a beer with my colleagues. We criticize them in return, but we do it in private. And I think that's it. It's like we all get angry and we all get frustrated about business, but I think kind of maintaining positivity and a kind of positive public face is pretty important.
I'll add to that. When I live in Boston, and the traffic's sort of nasty, but people honk their horns and they throw their hands up and they get super aggressive and really mean. And in Beijing, they honk their horns like crazy, but they don't get angry. And I couldn't figure out like what's with the honk, and there's no outrage, and they're just saying I'm here, and it's really weird to not see this outward anger. And Julian, if you want to add to it, you've lived there longer than I have. I didn't see any crime, like nothing.
So there's virtually no crime. It's incredibly safe. Like I said, I've never been involved in any kind of violence, but I think this is one reason though, and just on a kind of bigger, broader kind of geopolitical way of understanding, that's why I think, the West, and I think, maybe particularly the US, recently has had trouble kind of working with East Asian countries, because, if you're working with North Korea or you're working with China, just because they're not aggressive doesn't mean they're not annoyed. And I think sort of understanding that if you attempt to make the Chinese lose face, they will do anything to stop that happening. They would destroy their own country to make sure that they do not lose face. And so I think, there are some very smart negotiators that I've met who work for the American embassy and who work for the British embassy, but understanding that this is a subtle game where you kind of have to work about maintaining face whilst making progress is really important, because going about it in a kind of very, very jingoistic way, where you're kind of trying to make the other side look small, is not ever going to work in Asia. And, you could say the same about the Second World War. So that's just a sort of bigger kind of way of understanding this, I think.
Thank you, Julian. And our next hand up, I believe, was David.
Sorry, I can't turn my camera on. For some reason, my laptop won't allow it. But thank you, Julian, for the talk. So I'm relatively young to the group, so I'm 21, and it's just very interesting to hear this perspective about traveling for business, because that's something that I expect I will be doing a lot in my life. And I was just wanted to ask you about, obviously going to a new place is very foreign, is very difficult, and even more difficult when you're doing it alone. And with all the adversity that you faced right in the beginning, I was wondering if you have any strategies to recommend for people who are doing things on their own and, traveling to foreign places, around people that aren't that nice to them. Just how did you deal with it in the beginning?
So I think I probably dealt with it in the wrong way, actually. I think, one of the things I did when I first got to Beijing is I made friends with a bunch of Brits and Americans and Europeans. And, in some way, in the industry that I'm in, that wasn't necessarily a problem, because a lot of the people that I was working with originally, I worked in an international school, I worked for British Council. It wasn't so problematic, but I would sort of suggest that actually making friends as quickly as possible with people who are from the country is obviously the best strategy. Learning the language is really, really important. And I think that that can be challenging, because a lot of the conversations that you're having are small talk. And, after a while, what you really crave is kind of deep conversation. And obviously, it's a lot easier to have deep conversation with somebody who speaks the same language as you, maybe somebody who's from the same background as you. And you definitely crave that. But I think it's important in that first year to be willing to sit down with families, with people your own age, and kind of have conversations where maybe after a while they get a bit repetitive, because you're talking about where you're from and what you do. But I think getting good at that, getting good at talking to people, it's certainly a skill that I've developed. I think over 13 years of being here, is that I'm very happy now to sit and listen and to talk with somebody for an hour or two, where you know, I can learn from them, and you know, and we can kind of share something and build some kind of relationship. So I think kind of getting good at that and not kind of feeling like those kind of conversations aren't helping you to grow just because they might not necessarily be very deep.
And David, I'll add to that because I've been traveling since I was 18 years old, and starting with Germany, that was the first country, and then China was a real challenge because even though I was only there 4 months, I literally only know 3 words of Chinese. But a few things that have helped me throughout the years is never get angry, because you really don't know what's going on. Like, you might think that, oh, they're messing up or they're wrong, and so don't get angry, because I usually find that I'm wrong on that one. A lot of humor. I just smiled a lot, and body language goes a long way, but for the most part, I used humor to get through a lot of things. I mean, I've gotten lots of free rides in cars and getting onto a train and being put in the right direction, and humor just really works for me, just kind of staying playful with people, and people like to help. And the Chinese, I find, are very humorous. They're a playful bunch of people. I really enjoyed them. But yeah,
one of the things I have that. So one of my kind of life kind of ways of living, or kind of my life mottos, is like the pursuit of absurdity. And I will say China 13 years ago was more absurd, but it's still massively absurd. I find myself in situations where, you know, last week I went down to a conference in Shanghai and I had to sign an MOU. You know, I had to sit down at an enormous table and I had to sign kind of a big book that then got shared with another organization. There was cameras clicking. There was kind of, you know, it was insane. And I was just thinking to myself, you know, 15 years ago, if I had said to myself that I would be living in China, signing enormous kind of documents, you know, government officials, you know, it's hilarious. So I definitely think I would agree with that. I think humor is huge. And I think finding pleasure in the little things. So there's actually one more slide that I didn't show because I sort of thought I would neatly tie it up with the kulos where I am right now. But I'm going to show you the final slide that I didn't show you. It is this. And I think that it's really, really important to know a simple pleasure or simple pleasures in life that make you happy. So my wife is Danish, and she has lived in Beijing for 7 years, and I've been here for 13. And we now have a 20-month-old child, and we made an agreement with ourselves that no matter what money we made, no matter what happened to us in our life, we have always found enormous pleasure in sitting outside in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Laos, in Vietnam, sitting outside at a white plastic table, eating street food, drinking beer. That is something that always fills me with pleasure and always will fill us with pleasure. And I think appreciating that as something that's beautiful. You watch the world go by, you see people, you know, that means that nothing can ever be that bad. Because, you know, if everything failed, if everything collapsed in China, my business collapsed, whatever, I would happily move to Cambodia for a month. And I could sit outside every evening and I could, you know, it's sweltering hot, you're sweating, you have an ice cold beer, you know, you're eating delicious street food. And so I guess I would just close by saying I think it's pretty good for you to always, no matter where you go in the world, very quickly find something that you enjoy and something that makes you feel warm and positive, and then just make sure that whenever you're feeling down or you've got problems, that you can always go and do that thing and it will make you happy.
And the street food is delicious.
Yeah,
it's cheap too. Our next person with her hand up is Stephanie. Stephanie, you're on the air.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for sharing your story. It's really inspiring. I think you're doing a really great thing out there. You may have already answered this in the previous question, but you mentioned that in order to really, you know, have any brand there, you either need to be a large corporation already or have connections. So I was just curious of, you know, do you have any recommended strategies of really how do you make that initial ground break, you know, in a place where you may not have connection? Did you have connection or did you have to enter it kind of in your own way?
So I guess the number one answer to that is you have to live here. And whether that's living here for a month or whether that's coming out for 6 months or 13 years in my case, I think I would argue that trying to do business with China from the outside is virtually impossible. You know, this conference where I was last week in Shanghai, it was an education technology conference, the biggest in China. And, they were basically talking about how they procure for schools and universities in China. So this was their policy. If a school in China wants to buy some foreign technology or foreign ed tech in any way, they have to go to the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education will look around for local providers. If no one in China provides that service or something close to that service, they may permit that foreign technology can be purchased. So far, not one piece of British edtech is being used in government schools or universities in the whole of China. So essentially that's protectionism, as we all understand. They don't want foreign, competition. But, think about that, coming in as an outside provider, if you're trying to do that from abroad, is virtually impossible. You could set up an office here and you could try and do it that way. But the reality is, and this is what I'm now in discussions with, is you need to be meeting these government officials. You need to be going for dinners. You need to be building relationships. So what I've now said, and this is through my role in the British Chamber, I've said to them, look, they said to me, look, we want to export education products to the UK. And I said, well, we're not really interested in that. And they said, oh, why? You have a free market. I said, yeah, but there's no reciprocity. You can't export to us if we're not going to be able to sell to you. So I said, why would you not show as a gesture of goodwill that you are willing to use British education technology in your schools? You show us first, and then we're going to be more willing to bring your companies over to the UK and have them work out there. That only is going to exist once I've built relationships and I can kind of propose that as an idea. So I would very much say that kind of either building relationships here by coming out and showing that you're committed, or by building relationships with Chinese people in the US. But otherwise, I think it's going to be virtually impossible. And, one thing just to add to that, I know I touched on that earlier, but, there is a perception in China, and this comes very much from the 80s and 90s, but I think it's still true now, which is that foreign businesses want to come in, they want to exploit China, and then they want to leave with lots of money. And so that is very hard to break, that perception. And so I think it's really important, like I said about where we are now with these two lows down in China, we will come here every single year without fail for the rest of my life. We will never break that, because if we do this for 3 years and then we say, oh, actually, we don't want to come next year, they will lose trust in us, and any connections will be broken, and they will never regain that trust, because they will remember that year where we didn't show up and we said we were going to. So I think it's really important to actually decide, do you want to work with China for the next 50 years? Because if you don't, if you just want to come here for 3 years and make money and disappear, they're going to sense that. They're going to exploit you. They're going to rip you off, and they have no interest in building something. So I think you've got to look at this with a really long-term plan rather than just like making a quick buck.
Thank you very much.
And Stephanie, I'll add to it, if you did have an interest in going to China, and I would encourage you to do it. I did it for a summer job. Just land in China, but tomorrow, you as a Westerner, you can very easily get a job as an English teacher. You're highly respected as an English teacher.
You can come work for me.
See, we already have a job. Excellent.
I'm actually a piano teacher.
That would help as well. I know tomorrow, Teddy G from Teach for the Future, she actually finds Western teachers and sends them to Asia. She's a placement agent. So if you tune in tomorrow night, she might be able to help you with that. But also, once you get to China, the networking is really easy. You go on WeChat, you'll find an industry group that you like. That's how I met Julian. We actually met on WeChat, and it's super networking. Like, the people actually show up at events. It's not like Meetup or Facebook or LinkedIn in the US where you click and you join these groups and nothing ever happens.
I'd just like to add something, actually. Sorry, just quickly. One thing that's really awesome, I guess, someone was asking earlier, one of the most amazing things about living abroad is your network can be incredible. So when this is 12 years ago, I was sat at this event and I was sat next to the head of British Airways in China. I would never operate in that world in the UK. That world of CEOs in the UK is very kind of exclusive. Whereas in China, like, I very frequently meet like really high, like, top government officials, both from China and from the UK. I meet kind of people in business, because I guess what you all have in common is that you're foreigners in China. And so it's very easy to network, because, if I mean, it's very, very unlikely given that we're the first foreigners that have ever come to this village. But if I was to meet another foreigner here, we'd immediately start talking, we'd share details, we'd connect with each other. So it's really great. And then just one thing to say to all of you is if any of you are ever coming to China, like absolutely send me an email. We'll meet up. It's no problem at all. I would love to help any of you. I mean, I don't exactly know what you all do, but if you've got businesses or if you're looking to start something, like I'm happy to have a chat with you about what you're doing. And if you come out here, 100% come and go for dinner and have some beers.
Yeah, Julian's serious. That's how I met him. So he's not kidding. It's a really friendly environment. It really is a nice place. So I'd encourage you to go. And the next hand up I see is Kat. Hi, Kat.
Hi. Thank you so much. Just echoing
Hello.
everyone's comments, Julian. Great talk and super interesting and made the time go by super fast. Just a quick question. You mentioned earlier about how like when you were starting out or at some point like you were always like staying up late and really worried and couldn't sleep. And then eventually you were like, I can sleep like a baby and things are not finished. Like how did you get there basically? And like, what was it because you started being successful or you just learned to deal with it? Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of went from an anxious entrepreneur to one that was like a little bit more settled and less anxious?
It's a big question. I guess one of the things that I maybe mentioned, you know, that kind of the idea that I can always fall back on the UK is one thing. And I guess I should also say, you know, I'm relatively entitled, right? Like I'm a British person and I have a family in the UK and they have their own home. And if everything in the world went absolutely terribly, I could move back to my mum's house and I could sleep and I could cry all day and I would eventually be okay. And so I think I have that fallback and I want to make that clear. Like I'm entitled in that way and I acknowledge that entitlement. But I also think that one of the things that we do as an organization often is like we have an amazing team and we have a really, really positive team and people make mistakes, but we aren't, education is a slow process. You know, education is lifelong, right? And, you know, we might make a mistake with a parent or with a student and we might think, my God, you know, that was really bad. And we might get some pushback or some problems, but like, we're not going to kill anyone. I mean, touch wood, you know, we're not engaged in an industry where we really can like, you know, to kill people or kind of maim them or something. So I think for us, it really was about acknowledging that what we do is both incredibly important, but also at the same time, the mistakes that we make are not really that important at all. And I think kind of really internalizing that is important because I think otherwise you can start fretting about really small things. And, you know, one thing I would say is really valuable too is like taking time away from your business where you don't do anything with your business. You know, like it's really good. You know, I've been to the UK, for example. Okay, actually, a fun story. I mean, you might think this is a bit madness, but we went to North Korea this summer for a week to teach entrepreneurship education. This is myself and 2 colleagues. And there is no internet in North Korea and there's no mobile phones in North Korea. And so for a whole week, I had no access to the outside world, but I also had a huge amount of time to reflect and a huge amount of time to think about some of the challenges that we were going through. And the truth is, I kind of got back and I felt so awesome because actually I realized a lot of the things I thought were problems weren't really issues. So I think kind of having time to reflect and sort of thinking about maybe what is important. In my case, it's drinking beer in Southeast Asia, and kind of, you know, being able to reflect on that is really important.
Awesome, thank you.
And
Thank you.
Kat, to add to that, I've had, I think everyone in my class already knows, I could win a gold medal for anxiety. So I've had the whole, you know, I've had 6 companies and I've always worried on a daily basis, am I going to be, you know, homeless because things aren't working out. A few things that have helped me by traveling the world. One is if you're earning over $40,000 a year, you are a 1%er. You're in the 1% global wealth if you're earning over $40,000 a year. And when I see people whose poverty and lifestyle scares me by looking at them, seeing like how they're living, and then I realize, oh, they don't feel poor, and they're laughing and they're happy and they're hugging their kid and they seem to be having a good day. I realize that it's me and my perception. And if things got super, super awful, we can all move to a 3rd world country and teach English, and we will survive. And
yeah, one thing to say about that. I mean, it seems a little cynical, and obviously, we're speaking from a certain position, but getting a CELTA, the English teaching qualification, is 12,000 RMB, which is $1,500 and it takes 1 month, and it's probably the biggest security blanket you can give yourself in life. Because I did that qualification when I was 21. And it really means, if everything failed in China, I could move to Peru and I could teach English, or I could go to the Caribbean and I could be on a beautiful beach somewhere teaching English. So I do think we're all in a position where no matter what we do, we can go somewhere on earth, and whether or not it's teach, I think we can also have an impact. And I think that's also true, that there's limitless number of places where you can go on this planet, and you have expertise that they might want. And the most obvious thing is language, but whatever you've been doing, whether it's your degree or whether it's kind of your training or the job that you're doing now, like there's something that you can offer. And I think kind of realizing that and acknowledging that does make you kind of free, and being free is the most liberating kind of thing possible.
Julian, can you share with us the name of that certification, as well as your contact information? Some people were asking for that in the chat. What's the name of the certification again?
It's called a CELTA, CELTA.
Okay. Do you know what that stands for?
Yeah, it's the Cambridge English Language Teaching Accreditation, I think. And the reason I would recommend that is that you can do like a TEFL. A TEFL is like a teaching English as a foreign language thing, and you can do that online. The thing is that nobody respects that. I run an education organization. I want you to have actually done a month-long training where you've actually taught real people, and it's kind of well done. Whereas if you do an online teaching qualification, it's like you're not actually doing any teaching practice. So a CELTA is more expensive than doing a cheap online qualification, but ultimately it actually has value and people respect it.
Thank you. And your contact information outside of WeChat?
Yes, Julian@ventureeducation.org.
Julian@ventureeducation?
Yeah, .org.
.org. Okay, great. Thank you. And Kat, thank you for that question, because I think that helped probably everyone in the room. Like, it's really good to have a plan B. I think we'll all be okay. And I see Anna has her hand up. Anna, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi. I have a question more about the perception of Westerners by Chinese people. My experience with China was working in a global company, international, and on a team where we had people in America, people in Europe, and in China, and even internally within the organization, we were competing a lot on projects and cost, and obviously we Europeans and Americans were kind of more expensive. And so I was just really wondering what their perception of us is, whether they resent that or what is it. It was very interesting being there, working with them and being there, just really seeing how the Chinese interests, like national interests, were above the interests of the company. If we were trying to look for a supplier, and we have clear criteria and like corporate level, and it was like the law within the company. Well, in China it was different, like they would really get out of their way to push the Chinese companies to supply and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I'm not. I think that China offers something kind of interesting to the world right now. I think that they are maybe saying to the world that actually, look, the things have been done a certain way, that the Western world has said that things have to be a certain way, and that has benefited them enormously. And that these developed countries, they've written the rules and then they've benefited through the rules. So I do think that actually China is interesting in the sense that they're pushing back against that and saying, well, we want to benefit ourselves too. So I definitely think that exists. And that's interesting to me because, I don't think it all has to be one way, but I do think that that has changed quite dramatically just in the time that I've been here. When I arrived, being a foreigner in China meant that you were paid more money. That's now not the case at all. There's numerous bars in Beijing now where the bar staff are Americans. And, that's blown my mind, because if you'd have said that 15 years ago, that there would, be jobs for kind of, Americans and Europeans in Beijing working in a bar, that's changed so dramatically. So I don't know when you were here, but I guess that's changed very dramatically. But again, I think, that will have changed dramatically, I think. But I think also it really ties into everything I was saying. I think China, I think, sees through a lot of the language that's used by organizations when, what a lot of multinationals want to do is exploit. Now, you may disagree with that on some level, but I think ultimately that's what businesses are looking to do, is to generate profit. It is to kind of satisfy the shareholders. Now, they may have some CSR where they say, we really want to give back to the community. But the reality is they're businesses and they're profit driven and they're looking to make as much money as possible. And I think the truth is most Chinese government officials, employees look at that and say, well, you're here to make as much money as possible, so I want to get as much as possible from you. And I think that that's kind of fair in some ways, because, even though we may use more flowery language, I think, if you really want to succeed here as a small business or as an individual here, you have to be able to willing to say, look, I'm here long term. I'm also interested in China. I'm interested in you. I want to build relationships. I'm not just here to exploit. And I think that's definitely an area where China pushes back more than a lot of other countries. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I think otherwise we just get to kind of run ourselves all over the world and kind of say that we're doing a good thing. But in reality, I'm not sure what multinationals are trying to do in China other than to make a lot of profit. So, I know that might sound like a little bit of a liberal response to this, but it's about how much commitment you're willing to show here. And if you're just flying in for a year to work here and then you're flying out, I don't think it's going to lead to getting much respect from the Chinese side. I think that they really see that for what it is and they will treat you accordingly. Sorry, that's a bit of a tough answer, but sorry.
No. I think on a personal level, it was actually very much what you're saying. Like I was very surprised at very little time, taking us to see the war or the kind of Chinese things and Chinese way of whatever. Yes, they were very open on a personal level, kind of person to person, but more within the organization. It was a little tough.
Yeah. I mean, one thing just to quickly add to that too is that, I had a friend who worked for the Wall Street Journal. He was bureau chief in Hong Kong and now he works back in New York. And he said a long time ago, and, he's a very, very smart guy. And he said, the future of kind of China and kind of being a foreigner with China is not being in China. It's being a foreigner in another country who understands China. And I would say that that's really true right now. As China looks to expand its own organizations abroad, being somebody who's maybe spent even a couple of months here and really tried to understand what's happening, when Chinese companies enter into America, they're going to have to hire Chinese staff. They're going to have to hire American staff. And these American staff are going to have to communicate to Chinese managers and, to head office in China. So I think really trying to understand how China impacts things globally is also the next step. And I'd say that maybe is the future, because, that's going to happen. So kind of your experience, maybe the value is not actually in China. It might increasingly be, how can you offer a kind of bridge between China and the US or a European country or whatever. So that might be the future, or will be the future, I think.
And our last question of the night / morning is going to be Larry. Welcome, Larry.
Hello. How's everyone?
Hi.
Just want to say it was a great presentation. And one thing I had a question on is, as far as your day-to-day business with Chinese, how hard would you say the language barrier? I'm thinking about taking a job over there for the NBA as the youth global director, and I just want to kind of get a feel for the day-to-day language barriers that you might have to deal with.
So I was hoping I could get through these whole questions and answers without having to reveal my horrible truth. And my horrible truth is that my Chinese is terrible. I can't believe it. I nearly got away with it. Okay, so I've been here 13 years and my Chinese is pretty terrible. And what I should have done is I should have come out here. And in the first year, I should have moved to a village, which I had friends who did this, and I should have only spoken Chinese for a year, and I didn't. But what I would say now, I'm now going to give you I'm going to give you a massive excuse, but I think it's somewhat true, is that I don't think that language is how you have the most effective communication. I think it's really important, but I know a lot of people out here who speak Chinese, but they're complete assholes. And so it doesn't matter that they have the language. I don't think they've ever really tried to engage with China or Chinese people in any meaningful way. 50% of my team is Chinese, 50% is international. We have an incredible integration of everybody. I'm very fortunate that most of the Chinese staff speak English. So in some sense, I would say, you're not going to learn Chinese in a couple of months. You know, it's going to take you either 1 or 2 years only speaking Chinese. It's an incredibly difficult language to learn. The written language is even more difficult to learn. So of course, like, I can get by. I can communicate with, I can speak to people, and I can order food, and I can get by in taxis. But I mean, I'm on no level to do business in China in Chinese. And you up expressions, and I think it's really important, showing a willingness to learn. But honestly, I would say that it's more important that you actually try and find commonality with Chinese people through your kind of relationship with them than it is about language. Because most Chinese people, especially people working in an MBA program, and they're going to speak English anyway. So, what I would suggest is, like, I have certain go-to, like when I speak to Chinese people, let's say that I'm speaking to like a Chinese man and he's in his 40s. I will immediately try and start to talk to him about football. I mean, soccer. And it's quite likely that he will probably support a European team, because basically Chinese football is so terrible that most Chinese people adopt like a European team like Real Madrid or Man United. And immediately then I have something to engage them and something to talk with them about. So as much as language is a factor, I don't think it's actually about how good your Chinese is. I think it's more about how willing you are to engage people. And so that's not about language, especially if they speak English, and most Chinese people now do, especially people graduating now, they have really good English. So I would put much more of a focus onto building relationships than I would into learning language.
And I'll just add on to Julian and out myself that I had a great time in China, totally got around, no problem. And I know 3 words. I know hello, thank you, and yes, and that's it. Between my smiling and my body language and pointing at things really well, the apps in China are amazing. I mean, I would just take pictures of the coffee board at Starbucks and just like expand on the picture and like point at the large coffee. Google Translate. The apps are amazing, especially WeChat. You will be living and surviving and thriving off of WeChat. It's fine. Don't let the fact that you don't speak the language stop you. Just go. It wasn't a problem. And yes, it's scary, but that's okay too. So that's all the hands that we have up, and we're actually a few minutes over time. Julian, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and giving us a peek into China and how it works. And if there's anything that we can do for you, just reach out to us. And everyone, you have his email address, so feel free to reach out to me or Julian. And we will see you all tomorrow for our next installment of Business in Asia with Teddy. Julian, thank you so much. And
thank you so much, everybody.
Take care. 谢谢.
Okay. Bye bye. 再见.
Bye.